It happened without warning. A single moment outside the gates of Kensington Palace would change the course of royal history forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a single update about the unfolding story within the royal family. What you're about to hear is the account of a decision that shocked an entire nation. A brief speech, barely lasting a minute, but powerful enough to reshape the monarchy's image for generations. It was the moment Prince William confirmed what many inside the palace had feared for weeks, that Queen Camilla's royal role had been indefinitely suspended. What followed was confusion, heartbreak, and division not just within the royal household, but across Britain itself. That October evening was calm, but the air around Kensington Palace seemed to hold its breath. Reporters gathered in silence, cameras waiting, lights fixed upon the palace doors. When William stepped forward, there was no ceremony, no royal guard, no scripted pomp. He stood alone, his voice steady, his expression composed yet burdened. The statement he delivered contained only 63 words, but those words carried centuries of weight. He spoke of respect, of privacy, and of the duty to preserve stability within the institution. He did not utter Camilla's name, but everyone knew who he meant. The silence that followed was heavy. For a brief second, it felt as though the kingdom itself was holding its breath. Inside Buckingham and across the country, reactions were instant and divided. Supporters of William praised his courage, saying it was the act of a modern heir willing to make the hard decisions others avoided. To them, this was the future taking its rightful place, ensuring that the monarchy evolved in a world that demanded accountability and transparency. Yet others saw the announcement as a cruel exile, an unnecessary humiliation of someone who had dedicated years to supporting the crown. They saw compassion being replaced by cold strategy. Every news network and social feed erupted in debate. The world was watching the royal family, not as an institution, but as a family at war with its own heart. Behind the scenes, the truth was more complicated. Hours before the announcement, there had been a tense meeting inside Clarence House. King Charles, Camilla, and several senior advisors had gathered to review what was described as a Windsor transition brief. The document had been quietly drafted by William and Princess Anne, a detailed plan outlining the steps toward a generational transition within the monarchy. It focused on redefining roles, modernizing representation, and removing potential sources of controversy. When Camilla came across the document, she realized its implications immediately. It did not just suggest changes in structure, it effectively erased her from the future of the monarchy. What began as a routine discussion turned into a confrontation. Voices were raised, loyalties questioned, and trust shattered. Those who were present described the meeting as emotionally charged and deeply personal. Camilla, long accustomed to criticism, was not prepared for betrayal from within the family she had supported. Her relationship with William had always been polite but distant. The discovery of the document made her feel not only sidelined but deceived. Charles tried to calm her, reminding everyone that the document was only a draft, a discussion point, not a decree. But the truth was clear. The draft was William's vision of the future, one that left no clear place for her. By the time the meeting ended, the rift had become irreparable. The next morning, as dawnlight spilled over Kensington, William sat in his study reviewing that same document again. Across from him were Princess Anne and Catherine. The three spoke quietly, weighing every word, every consequence. They understood the gravity of what they were preparing to do. Anne, ever pragmatic, believed the monarchy could not afford to appear fractured or indecisive. Catherine, compassionate but realistic, knew that keeping the institution stable sometimes meant personal sacrifice. William listened to them both. He felt the burden of duty pressing upon him in ways few could understand. It was not about power or ambition. It was about protecting an ancient institution from internal disarray. For William, this was not an act of rebellion, but of preservation. He had watched his father's reign struggle with public doubt and internal strain. He knew the monarchy could not survive if it appeared lost in conflict and confusion. He believed that removing Camilla's public role, at least temporarily, would calm the waters and allow a new generation to take responsibility. Yet he also knew that no matter how carefully he justified it, the decision would hurt those closest to him, especially his father. Later that afternoon, William drove to meet Charles privately. The conversation between father and son has since been described by insiders as one of the most difficult in royal history. Charles, still recovering from months of stress and health issues, was emotional and weary. William spoke first, his tone respectful but resolute. He explained that the monarchy was entering a decisive decade, that public trust was fragile, and that leadership required decisive action. Charles listened, his eyes heavy, his hands folded. When William mentioned Camilla, the atmosphere changed. The king's voice trembled with anger and disbelief. He accused William of acting without compassion, of allowing duty to consume empathy. William replied quietly that compassion could not come at the cost of the monarchy's survival. Their words, though private, revealed the eternal conflict within every royal generation, the choice between love and responsibility. Camilla, it is said, overheard fragments of that conversation. What she heard confirmed what she already feared. Her royal future was over, not through scandal or resignation, but through quiet removal. She retreated that evening to Ray Mill House, her private residence in Wiltshire, away from cameras, away from the world. Those close to her described her mood as numb rather than angry. She had fought through decades of judgment, but this was different. This was silence. In that silence, she understood that her role had been rewritten without her consent. Outside the palace walls, the press was already building a storm. Speculation filled the air, theories ranging from health concerns to behind-the-scenes feuds. But William's brief statement remained the only official word. 63 words that balanced carefully between truth and discretion. He had said just enough to confirm the change, but not enough to expose the pain behind it. It was a calculated decision, one that prioritized the institution over emotion. To the public, it was shocking. To those inside the palace, it was devastating. As the night wore on, London's skyline glowed beneath a haze of camera lights and speculation. Some called it the end of an era, others the dawn of a new one. The monarchy, once again, stood at a crossroads. What had begun as a son's difficult decision now echoed as a national reckoning about what leadership truly means.
In the hours that followed the announcement, Buckingham Palace became a fortress of whispers and uneasy silences. Staff members moved quietly through the halls, unsure of what to say or to whom they could speak freely. The tension was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. Though no official statement from the king had been released, it was clear to everyone inside that something irreversible had just occurred. William's announcement had not only reshaped the line of royal authority, it had broken something far deeper, the delicate emotional thread that bound the family together. Those close to Charles say he spent the night pacing his study in Clarence House, rereading William's public words on a printed page. Each phrase felt distant and rehearsed, a reflection of his son's newfound independence. To him, the statement carried both pride and betrayal. Pride because he had raised a son capable of leadership. Betrayal because that leadership came at the cost of compassion. Charles had always seen the monarchy as a family first and an institution second, believing that love was the glue that held the crown together. But now, confronted with his son's pragmatic logic, he realized that perhaps the next generation saw things differently. Meanwhile, at Kensington, William's mood was a mix of relief and regret. The decision had been made, the words spoken, and yet the weight of it all remained. Catherine could see it in his eyes, the quiet turmoil of a man who knew he had done what was necessary but not what was easy. She reminded him that leadership often demands difficult choices, that people would come to understand his intentions in time. But even as she spoke, she understood that some wounds in families never truly heal, no matter how noble the reasons behind them. Publicly, reactions were fierce. Across television networks and social media, the story dominated every headline. Royal commentators debated the motives, experts analysed body language, and former palace aides offered contradictory accounts of what had led to this moment. Some said William had acted too swiftly, others argued he had waited too long. But amid the noise, one fact remained clear: the monarchy had entered uncharted territory. Never before had such a decisive statement been made without the king's direct endorsement. It was a generational fracture, exposed before the eyes of millions. Inside royal circles, the Windsor Transition Brief became the most discussed document in Britain. Leaked details painted it as a long-term strategic outline, intended to modernize operations and redistribute responsibilities among younger members of the family. It had been drafted with care, reviewed by senior advisors, and supported by Princess Anne, whose reputation for discipline and duty lent credibility to the plan. But the section concerning Camilla was what captured everyone's attention. It described a reassessment of public representation, a diplomatic phrase that effectively ended her visible role in the monarchy. The phrasing was deliberate, the tone clinical, but its meaning was unmistakable. The Queen Consort would step aside indefinitely, allowing the monarchy to transition toward generational unity. For Camilla, discovering that language had felt like a dagger cloaked in bureaucracy. Every sentence stripped away a piece of her identity. She had spent years earning a place at the king's side, shaping her public image from controversy into quiet dignity. Now, in a few carefully written paragraphs, that progress had been erased. Those close to her said she wept not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. She had fought for acceptance all her life, only to lose it in the cold efficiency of reform. At Clarence House, the tension between Charles and William reached its breaking point. Reports suggest that the father confronted his son again the following day, this time without advisors or intermediaries. It was a deeply emotional exchange, filled with long silences and unfinished sentences. Charles questioned whether William understood the cost of his actions, not just to the family but to himself. He warned that once compassion is sacrificed for order, something vital in a leader's soul begins to fade. William listened, his jaw tense, his gaze fixed on the floor. He wanted to explain that his actions were not meant to wound, but to protect. Yet he also knew that any justification would sound hollow in the face of his father's pain. The conflict between them represented more than a personal disagreement. It symbolized the timeless struggle between two visions of monarchy. One rooted in tradition, patience, and forgiveness. The other grounded in pragmatism, responsibility, and modern image. For centuries, royal heirs had faced the same dilemma, whether to preserve the old or embrace the new. This time, however, the debate was not confined to the corridors of the palace. It was playing out in real time across the nation, watched by millions who interpreted it through their own values. Among the public, sympathy was divided. Older generations felt sorrow for the king, seeing him as a father blindsided by duty's cruelty. Younger voices saw William as a necessary reformer, willing to do what others could not. The internet became a battlefield of emotion, each opinion louder than the last. Hashtags trended, op-eds flooded news feeds, and late-night shows dissected every second of the speech. The monarchy had always been an emblem of quiet continuity, but now it was a living drama, raw and exposed. Behind closed doors, Princess Anne tried to restore calm. She had long served as the family's voice of reason, the one who faced storms with stoic composure. She reached out to both Charles and William separately, reminding them that history would judge them not by their pain, but by their restraint. To her, the monarchy was bigger than any individual, and survival depended on unity, however fragile. She believed William's plan, though controversial, was rooted in genuine care for the institution. Yet she also knew that compassion was the one quality the public still demanded from their royals. Without it, authority could quickly turn to alienation. Catherine, too, played a quiet but crucial role during this fragile period. While William carried the burden of leadership, she carried the emotional weight of the family. She reached out to staff members who were unsure of their positions, offered comfort to those closest to the king, and made sure the children were shielded from the media frenzy. Her calm presence became the invisible thread holding the household together. She told William late one night that this decision, painful as it was, would define not just his legacy but their family's strength. Outside London, Camilla's retreat to Ray Mill House became the subject of endless speculation. Reporters camped at the edge of the village, hoping for a glimpse, but she remained unseen. Locals described her as quiet, withdrawn, and deeply private. Flowers were left at her gate by both supporters and critics, a surreal mix of sympathy and protest. Some saw her retreat as dignified, others as an act of silent rebellion. Yet to those who knew her best, it was neither. It was grief. The grief of someone who had spent years walking beside power, only to find herself erased from its story. By the end of that week, the monarchy had entered a period of reflection. There were no public appearances, no official events, only silence. The country waited for another statement that never came. In that silence, the reality of what had happened began to settle. A son had taken control of a legacy older than himself, a father had lost both authority and peace of mind, and a woman who once stood beside a king now stood alone. It was not just a royal crisis. It was a deeply human story of love, loss, and leadership colliding in ways no one could have predicted. Days turned into weeks, but the echo of William's announcement refused to fade. Every corner of Britain seemed to hum with speculation. Morning programmes dissected it, evening papers dramatised it, and even casual conversations in cafes and classrooms drifted toward the same question. Why now? What had truly driven William to make such a bold and irreversible move? Some claimed it was a strategic decision years in the making, a coordinated transition designed to ensure the monarchy's survival in an era of uncertainty. Others insisted it was personal, the culmination of long-simmering tensions within the royal household. But as more information emerged, a clearer picture began to form, a story not of ambition or rivalry, but of conviction. In the quiet halls of Kensington Palace, William worked tirelessly behind the scenes to implement the transition plan. The Windsor transition brief had been finalised with Anne's guidance and Catherine's support, and now it was time to turn ideas into structure. Meetings with senior courtiers filled his days. Every aspect of public representation was reviewed, from patronages and ceremonial duties to the handling of official correspondence. The focus was on stability, continuity, and a carefully managed shift toward a younger generation of royals. To the outside world, it might have seemed like a simple administrative adjustment, but within the palace, everyone knew it was far more than that. It was a quiet revolution. Anne's influence was crucial. Her reputation for discipline and unwavering commitment gave William's plan a sense of legitimacy among traditionalists who might otherwise have resisted. She reminded her nephew often that modernization should never mean recklessness. "You don't dismantle what you're trying to protect," she reportedly told him during one late-night discussion. William nodded. He respected her deeply, not just as an aunt, but as a figure who embodied the crown's endurance through decades of change. She had seen scandal, loss, and transition before. Her presence reassured him that what he was doing, though painful, was part of a larger cycle, a process of renewal that every era demanded. Catherine's role was more emotional but no less vital. She became William's confidant during those long evenings when the palace seemed to stand still. She would often find him in his office, the desk covered with notes and reports, his phone lighting up with new headlines and reactions. She would sit beside him quietly until he looked up, then remind him of why he had chosen this path. "It isn't about removing someone," she would say softly. "It's about saving something." That phrase became his anchor. It reminded him that leadership was never about comfort or popularity. It was about doing what must be done when no one else will. Still, the emotional toll was immense. William knew that every decision he made was being weighed not only by the public but by his own father. The distance between them had become almost physical. They spoke rarely, and when they did, the words were formal, polite, and stripped of warmth. Charles's silence was not anger so much as sorrow. Those close to him described him as a man haunted by the duality of his roles, as a father who loved his son, and as a monarch who had been outmaneuvered by him. He continued to perform his duties with composure, attending meetings, reviewing documents, maintaining appearances. But those who knew him best saw the difference in his eyes. They were tired, reflective, as if constantly searching for meaning in a world that had changed too fast. Camilla's absence was felt everywhere. Her office at Clarence House remained untouched, her desk still neatly arranged, her photographs still in their frames. For the staff who had worked closely with her, the atmosphere was somber. Some privately expressed guilt for having known about the Windsor transition brief before she did. Others wondered how long she would remain away from public life. Rumours circulated that she had begun declining calls, that she spent her days tending to her garden and reading letters of support that arrived daily. A few letters, however, were cruel. They accused her of being the reason for the turmoil, of dividing the family. She read them all without response, neither defending nor condemning anyone. For the first time in years, she had nothing left to say. Meanwhile, the media continued to feed on the story. Each photograph of William was analysed for meaning, his expression, his posture, even the colour of his tie. Theories about palace divisions filled airwaves. Commentators speculated about the king's health, about the possibility of abdication, about whether the monarchy itself could withstand such internal fracture. Through it all, Kensington Palace remained silent. No denials, no clarifications. The official narrative was the one William had already delivered. The Queen Consort would be stepping back indefinitely, and the royal family requested privacy and understanding. It was a masterclass in restraint, designed to prevent escalation. Yet that silence only deepened public curiosity. Privately, William's resolve hardened. He believed history would judge him not for the pain of this moment, but for the stability that followed. He spent hours studying archives of past transitions, letters written by monarchs of the 20th century who had faced similar crises, though under very different circumstances. He noted the recurring theme that survival always required sacrifice. The names and faces changed, but the lesson remained constant. The crown endures only when emotion yields to duty. That thought both comforted and haunted him. Catherine often worried about how much he carried inside. She could see it in the way he spoke, measured, deliberate, careful to avoid revealing too much even to those he trusted. When he spoke about his father, there was admiration but also sadness. When he mentioned Camilla, his voice softened, as if acknowledging the human cost of his actions. He did not despise her. On the contrary, he respected her strength. But he also knew that her presence had become a point of vulnerability for the monarchy, a lingering reminder of a past that many wished to move beyond. To him, this was not exile, it was restoration. Yet in private moments, he wondered if that distinction mattered to anyone but himself. Far from London, at Ray Mill House, Camilla began to write. Not statements, not letters to the press, but private reflections she never intended to publish. Her words were personal, poetic even, capturing the quiet ache of a life lived in the shadow of power. She wrote about the loneliness of public life, about how every smile and every silence could be misinterpreted. She wrote about love as both a gift and a burden. And she wrote about forgiveness, not as something granted or received, but as something that must live quietly within the heart, even when no one else sees it. Charles eventually sent her a letter. Those who have seen it say it was brief and handwritten, the words uneven and deeply emotional. "You once told me love was our only rebellion," it said. "I fear I have rebelled against it." It was both an apology and an admission of helplessness. Camilla read it several times before setting it down beside her bed. For the first time in weeks, she cried, not out of anger, but out of mourning for what had been lost. She forgave him in silence, though she could not forgive the institution that had made love and duty enemies of each other. In the capital, preparations were already underway for the next phase of royal transition. Public engagements were being reassigned, new advisors appointed, and public statements drafted to emphasize unity. But beneath that polished surface, everyone inside the palace knew the truth. This unity came at a cost. A family once bound by shared duty now carried invisible scars, and those scars would not fade easily. The monarchy had survived scandal before. It had endured tragedy, controversy, and public doubt. But this was different. This was not a scandal imposed from the outside. It was a fracture born from within. And though the public could debate endlessly about right and wrong, no one could deny one simple truth. The future had arrived, and it had demanded a sacrifice. As the dust of the announcement began to settle, the royal household tried to regain its rhythm. Meetings resumed, official documents continued to circulate, and appearances were planned months ahead, but nothing felt the same. A quiet unease lingered behind the palace walls. For those who had served the family for decades, the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. There had always been tension, as there always is in a family bound by both love and hierarchy, but this was different. It was as if a thread had been cut, and no one knew how to tie it back together. Charles withdrew further into his private world. His days followed routine, briefings, correspondence, ceremonial approvals, but his energy seemed dimmed. The crown still sat upon his head, but the weight of it had become heavier. He missed the easy laughter that used to fill private dinners, the sense of closeness that had once existed between him and his eldest son. Whenever he thought of William now, there was a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Pride that his son had shown courage and leadership, heartbreak that it had come at such a cost. The crown had always demanded loyalty to something greater than oneself, but this time, the sacrifice felt too personal. Those closest to Charles noticed subtle changes. His nights grew longer, his mornings quieter. He spent more time reading, often retreating to his study with old letters and diaries that reminded him of his youth. It was there, one evening, that he came across a note he had written decades earlier about what it meant to be a good king. It spoke of compassion, forgiveness, and the belief that strength comes from understanding. He realized, reading those words now, that they belonged to another time. The world had changed. His son's generation saw leadership through a different lens, one that valued decisiveness over sentiment. It was not wrong, merely different. Still, that realization brought him no comfort. At Kensington Palace, William pressed forward with his duties, appearing in public more often, giving speeches about modernization, service, and continuity. His composure was flawless, his tone measured, his gestures practiced. To the world, he appeared unshakable, the embodiment of calm leadership in a time of change. Yet in private, he wrestled with doubt. Every time he saw a newspaper headline questioning his motives, he felt a flicker of unease. He knew history would form its own conclusions, but it was the personal cost that haunted him. There were nights when he would sit alone in his office, staring out at the palace gardens, wondering whether his father could ever truly forgive him. Catherine sensed his turmoil even when he tried to hide it. She often joined him in the evenings after their children were asleep, listening quietly as he spoke of the endless weight of duty. She reminded him that what he had done was not an act of cruelty, but of necessity. Sometimes love means stepping back, she would say. Sometimes protecting the future means being misunderstood. Her words offered temporary comfort, but the guilt never left entirely. He had done what he believed was right for the monarchy, yet it had left the family fractured, the heart of it bruised. Meanwhile, Princess Anne continued to play her steady role as mediator. She visited both Charles and William separately, offering counsel without judgment. She reminded them that history had seen worse storms and that the crown, despite everything, had always found a way to endure. To Charles, she spoke gently of acceptance, urging him to see William's actions not as betrayal, but as the natural rhythm of succession. To William, she offered caution. The institution will endure, she told him, but never forget that it endures through people, not policies. Never lose sight of that. Her words resonated deeply, and though he did not say it aloud, William admired his aunt more than anyone else in those difficult months. Camilla, still secluded at Ray Mill House, began to rebuild a quiet routine. Away from public eyes, she found solace in the simplicity of her surroundings, the sound of birds at dawn, the rustle of wind through the garden, the rhythm of solitude. Friends who visited described her as composed, but beneath that composure was an unmistakable sadness. She had accepted the reality of her exile, but not the manner of it. To her, the most painful part was not losing her title or duties, but losing the trust of those she had once stood beside. She still loved Charles, perhaps now more than ever, because both of them were trapped by decisions neither could undo. Charles wrote to her often. Their correspondence became his refuge. He confided his regrets, his confusion, his longing for the days when they could speak freely without the eyes of the world upon them. In one letter he wrote, "The world sees power in crowns and ceremonies, but I see power in the quiet of your forgiveness." Camilla never responded with anger. Her letters were tender, almost philosophical. She wrote about the nature of loyalty, about how every heart must one day choose between peace and pride. She told him she forgave him, but she could not return, not yet. To do so would only reopen the wound. The public narrative began to soften over time. The initial outrage and shock gave way to introspection. Journalists began writing more measured pieces, exploring the human dimensions of the crisis rather than the scandal. Documentaries revisited the event, framing it as part of a larger story about generational change and the evolving nature of monarchy. The tone shifted from condemnation to curiosity. People began to ask whether perhaps William's actions, however painful, had been necessary to secure the monarchy's future, in an age when public confidence could turn overnight. Behind the facade of stability, however, the emotional landscape of the royal family remained fragile. Each member carried a private burden. For William, it was the knowledge that his decision had caused his father pain. For Charles, it was the lingering sense of being left behind by time. For Camilla, it was the quiet sorrow of becoming a ghost in a world she once inhabited fully. For Catherine and Anne, it was the exhausting task of holding everyone together while pretending nothing had changed. One evening, William sat alone with a collection of old photographs, family gatherings, public ceremonies, moments frozen in the warmth of happier years. He paused on an image of himself standing beside his father, both smiling under the summer sun. In that picture there was no distance, no division, only pride and love. For a moment he felt the weight of what had been lost. He whispered to the empty room, "I did what I had to do." The words felt hollow, but they were all he had. Elsewhere at Clarence House, Charles placed a final letter on his desk, addressed simply to "My son." In it, he wrote that leadership is not measured by the absence of mistakes, but by the courage to live with them. He told William that he understood now what he could not before, that sometimes love and duty can never walk the same path. "You chose the crown," he wrote, "and I chose the heart. Neither of us was wrong, but both of us must live with what that means." The letter was never made public. It remained sealed, stored among Charles's private papers, but its words captured the truth of what the nation had witnessed. The monarchy had survived the storm, but the family within it had paid the price. For the first time in years, the British people began to see their royals not as untouchable symbols but as human beings, flawed, burdened, and deeply real. The monarchy had been modernized, yes, but it had also been stripped of the warmth that once made it feel familiar. The institution had endured, but something intangible had been lost in the process: the quiet grace of unity. And yet beneath the sorrow and the silence, there lingered a faint sense of hope. The decisions had been made, the pain endured, and the future, however uncertain, was beginning to take shape. What remained was a question that would echo long after the headlines faded. When duty and love collide, which one truly defines a leader? The weeks turned into months, and slowly the palace began to find a new rhythm, one more restrained, one more cautious. Officially, the transition had succeeded. The monarchy had stabilized, and the younger generation was at the forefront of public life. Appearances became more streamlined, the tone of speeches more modern, and the public image of the institution cleaner than it had been in years. Yet inside the grand stone walls of Buckingham and Kensington, the emotional residue of what had happened remained thick in the air. Charles continued to fulfill his royal duties, though those closest to him could sense that the weight of kingship had turned inward. He was quieter during meetings, more contemplative at state events. When he smiled, it was polite rather than warm, practiced rather than genuine. His health had improved, but the vitality he once carried seemed diminished. He had become a man defined by reflection. His days often ended late in the evening, alone in his study, the light from the desk lamp spilling across scattered papers and unread letters. Those moments were his refuge, his only escape from the constant pull of responsibility. Sometimes he would reread the speech William had given that night at Kensington. 63 words. That was all it took to rewrite everything. He understood now that it was not an act of rebellion but of resolve. His son had chosen duty in its purest, hardest form. It was something Charles had always admired and feared in equal measure. Leadership, he had learned, is not measured by kindness alone, but by the ability to act when others hesitate. Still, the knowledge did not dull the ache. He had lost not a crown, but a closeness that could never be restored. Camilla, meanwhile, had settled into a life of solitude at Ray Mill House. The initial flood of media attention had subsided, and the reporters who once hovered outside her gates had long since left. The village returned to its usual quiet rhythm, and she blended into it seamlessly. Her days began early and ended simply. She walked her dogs through the fields, read for hours, and spent her evenings writing letters to a small circle of confidants. There was a peace in her solitude, though not without sadness. She no longer watched royal broadcasts. The life she had once shared in was now something she observed from afar, like a painting she had once stood inside but could never enter again. Each night she returned to Charles's letters. She kept them in a small box by her bedside, tied with a faded blue ribbon. His words had become her comfort, a quiet conversation that replaced the one they could no longer have in person. In one letter he wrote, "You once told me love was not bound by circumstance. I think of that now every morning as the sun rises on a crown that feels colder than ever." She read that line often. It reminded her that despite the separation, their bond still existed, invisible but unbroken. She forgave him as she always had, but she could not forgive the silence that surrounded them. The world outside the palace had begun to move on. Public attention drifted toward new headlines, new controversies, new distractions. Yet every so often, the subject resurfaced, especially during anniversaries or royal events. Commentators still debated the moral implications of William's decision. Was it compassion or calculation, strength or betrayal? No one could quite agree. To some, it was the mark of a visionary leader who had secured the monarchy's future. To others, it was the act of a son who had forgotten the value of forgiveness. But the truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. William carried himself with quiet purpose. His schedule was relentless. Charity engagements, international visits, and council meetings filled his calendar. He had become the face of renewal, the embodiment of responsibility. But those who knew him well saw the weight he carried behind the smiles. In public, he was composed and articulate. In private, he was introspective, sometimes distant. Late at night, he would walk the halls of Kensington, the portraits of past monarchs watching over him. He often wondered if they, too, had faced the same torment, the question of how much of oneself must be given up to serve something eternal. Catherine remained his anchor. Her calm presence balanced his constant self-doubt. She understood his silence better than anyone, for she shared in it. Together they had built their public image upon unity and composure, but behind closed doors there were moments of quiet vulnerability. On some nights she found him by the window, staring out over the city lights. "You did what you had to," she would whisper. And though he nodded, she knew that deep down he would always question whether it had been worth the cost. Anne continued her role as the quiet bridge between father and son. Her patience, her refusal to dramatize, made her the only one either man truly trusted to speak freely. She often reminded both that time has a way of softening even the deepest divides. She encouraged Charles to see William not as a rival, but as an heir who had inherited not only the crown's authority but its burden. To William, she offered counsel born of decades of experience. "History will remember you for your steadiness, not your sorrow, but never let it remember you as someone who forgot his heart." Those words lingered with William for months. He began to visit his father more often, sometimes unannounced, sometimes under the pretense of work. Their conversations were brief but meaningful. Slowly, the air between them began to thaw. There were no grand reconciliations, no tearful apologies, just a gradual understanding that both had done what they believed was right. They did not need to agree to forgive each other. Camilla, too, found her peace in a different way. As spring arrived, she reopened part of her residence to a small circle of close friends and relatives. They shared long dinners, spoke of books and art, and avoided the subject of the palace altogether. She began volunteering quietly with a local foundation, finding purpose again outside the shadow of royalty. Though she knew she would never return to public life, she also knew that her story was not one of defeat but of endurance. She had survived scrutiny, love, loss, and now silence, and through it all she had remained herself. The monarchy outwardly was steady once more. Public trust had improved, the younger royals had stepped into their roles seamlessly, and the institution itself looked more united than it had in years. But beneath the polished surface lay an invisible truth. Stability had come at the expense of warmth. The family had chosen endurance over emotion, structure over sentiment. The people saw their royals as dignified and resolute, but few realized how much they had given up to maintain that image. One evening, long after the public's attention had drifted elsewhere, William sat with Catherine in the quiet of their private garden. The air was cool, the city distant. He confessed that he still thought of that night at Kensington, of the words he had spoken and the silence that followed. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," he said. "Not because it was wrong, but because it was right." Catherine took his hand and said, "Right things have a cost. The difference is, you paid it." He looked up at the stars, the same ones that had watched over his ancestors for centuries, and realized that every generation before him had faced a similar test. Power and love, duty and compassion, they never existed peacefully together for long. The crown demanded one, life demanded the other. He understood then that the monarchy was not built on perfection, but on endurance. And endurance, he knew, was its own form of grace. In that moment, the world outside felt distant, the noise of speculation forgotten. What remained was a simple truth that echoed quietly in his mind. Leadership does not free one from sacrifice, it requires it. As the seasons changed and the intensity of public scrutiny faded, the storm that had once engulfed the royal family settled into something quieter, something far more introspective. The monarchy had survived the most turbulent moment in its modern history. But survival, as those within the palace knew, came with scars that time alone could not erase. The institution had endured, redefined itself, and emerged more streamlined and modern, yet the cost of that transformation was deeply human. It was felt not in ceremony or speeches, but in silence, in the moments between duty and reflection, where love and responsibility still wrestled for dominance. William continued to rise each day before dawn, his mornings filled with briefings, calls, and carefully structured meetings. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made in public, was weighed not just for its meaning, but for its legacy. He had become the face of renewal, the symbol of a monarchy reborn from its own fracture. To the world he was calm, strong, decisive. But inside, he carried the knowledge that leadership was never a destination, only an ongoing test. He had chosen duty over comfort, truth over sentiment, and though he knew it was necessary, he sometimes wondered whether the crown could ever truly coexist with the heart. Catherine watched him with quiet understanding. Her strength had never come from commanding attention, but from grounding those around her. In the rare moments they were alone, she could see the burden in his expression, the subtle way his eyes clouded when conversation drifted toward family. She often reminded him that the measure of leadership is not in how one begins a reign, but in how one carries its weight. Together, they had learned to live with both the glory and the ache of history. Charles, in his solitude, found himself returning more often to his private gardens. Age and reflection had softened him, though the events of that fateful year remained etched in memory. He still missed Camilla, not with longing but with a kind of quiet reverence for what they had shared. Their love had been unconventional, controversial, and enduring. Even now, separated by distance and duty, it remained one of the few things that had felt real amid the illusions of power. His letter to her, the one in which he wrote of love as rebellion, had been his last attempt to express the depth of what he could not say aloud. He knew she had forgiven him, but he also knew that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. At Ray Mill House, Camilla had found her rhythm once more. Her world was smaller, but her peace was deeper. She had grown to cherish the quiet, to find beauty in routine. The world no longer watched her, and for the first time in decades, she could breathe freely without the gaze of expectation. Her friends said she seemed content, though there was always a trace of wistfulness when she spoke of the past. She often described her years in public life as a chapter of both love and endurance, a period that tested her spirit, and in doing so revealed her strength. Sometimes she still wrote to Charles. Her letters were gentle, reflective, filled with gratitude rather than regret. She spoke of the garden, the changing seasons, the small joys of ordinary life. And in those letters there was an unspoken truth. Love, though altered by circumstance, never fully disappears. It simply learns to exist differently, quietly, but no less real. The rest of the royal family carried on with a renewed sense of duty. Anne remained a pillar of discipline, guiding both father and son with her unflinching practicality. She had no illusions about the cost of leadership, and rarely allowed emotion to cloud her perspective. Yet even she, in rare private moments, admitted that what had transpired between Charles, Camilla, and William would shape the family for generations. It had not been an act of cruelty or rebellion, but of transition, a moment when the monarchy had chosen survival over sentiment. Across Britain, the public perception of the royal family began to shift. The younger generation was seen as more relatable, more aligned with the spirit of modern times. The monarchy, once viewed as distant and rigid, now seemed human again, not because it had avoided pain, but because it had endured it in full view of the world. That vulnerability, carefully managed yet undeniably real, rekindled a sense of connection between the crown and the people it served. In time, historians would write about this period as a defining chapter. They would debate motives, analyze letters, and quote that 63-word speech that had changed everything. Some would argue that the decision to remove Camilla from public life was an act of preservation. Others would say it was a necessary evolution. But the truth, as those who lived through it knew, was more complex. It was not a story of victory or defeat, but of sacrifice, a balancing act between the personal and the eternal. For William, the lesson endured. Leadership, he realized, is not about perfection but about courage in imperfection. It is the willingness to make impossible choices, knowing that every decision leaves a shadow. He had spent countless nights questioning himself, wondering if there could have been another way. But over time, he came to understand that there rarely is. The path of a monarch, like the crown itself, is unyielding. It demands not what is fair, but what is necessary. Charles, too, came to see the broader arc of what had unfolded. The pain that once consumed him softened into acceptance. He had lived long enough to witness the monarchy he had served reshape itself into something capable of lasting beyond him. That was the true purpose of his reign, to ensure that the institution would not only survive but adapt. And though it had cost him dearly, he took solace in knowing that his son had carried that vision forward, even when it meant standing against him. In the quiet of Ray Mill House on a late summer evening, Camilla stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was still, the light golden. She thought of Charles, of the life they had shared, and of the crown that had taken so much and given so little in return. Yet in that moment, she did not feel bitterness. She felt gratitude for the love that had once been fierce and for the peace that now surrounded her. She whispered softly to herself, "Some stories are not meant to end in triumph, only in truth." And that was the truth of it all. The monarchy had changed, the world had moved on, and yet beneath the ceremony and the tradition, it remained what it had always been. A family, flawed and fragile, carrying the burden of history on its shoulders. The decision William had made was not the end of that story. only another chapter in its long, unending tale. As Britain settled into its new era, the memory of those days lingered like a faint echo. The speech, the confrontation, the exile, all of it had left a mark, not just on those who lived it, but on the very soul of the monarchy itself. It had proven that love and power could not coexist without conflict, that every act of renewal comes at a human cost. Yet it had also proven something else, that even in heartbreak there is continuity. In the end, as the years passed and the pain dulled into remembrance, the monarchy endured. It stood as it always had, between the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The people still watched, still judged, still cared. And somewhere within that ancient balance of tradition and transformation, the legacy of that fateful decision remained, etched not in gold, but in the quiet hearts of those who had lived through it. Because in the House of Windsor, leadership was never about power alone. It was about sacrifice. It was about love that endures, even when it cannot prevail. And above all, it was about the eternal truth that some crowns shine brightest only after they have been forged in sorrow.